Here is something that might genuinely mess with your sense of how the world works. In 1907, the busiest year in the history of American immigration, more than 1 million people entered the United States through Ellis Island. And here is the part almost nobody knows. Not a single one of them needed a passport. No visa, no papers of any kind. The only information the United States government had about you was whatever you verbally told the shipping clerk when you boarded the boat in Europe. That was it. You showed up, a doctor glanced at you for a few minutes, an inspector asked you some questions, and in most cases, within a few hours, you were an American resident, walking out the door with no ID, no documents, nothing. One historian described it perfectly. There was no welcome to America. Here is your new photo ID. There was just America. And it was not only immigrants. American citizens themselves lived their entire lives without ever needing a passport. For roughly the first 140 years of the nation's existence, with two brief wartime exceptions, an American could walk down to the docks in New York or Boston or San Francisco, buy a ticket, and sail to London, Buenos Aires, Shanghai, almost anywhere on Earth, carrying nothing but money and luggage. The border, as we understand it today, the checkpoint, the booth, the little book with your photo in it, simply did not exist. So, the questions basically ask themselves, how did a world without passports actually function? Why did governments on both sides of the Atlantic deliberately choose open borders for half a century? And what happened between 1914 and 1918 that slammed that world shut so completely that, 100 years later, most of us cannot even imagine it ever existed? Because here is the thing. The passport requirement was never supposed to be permanent. It was sold to the public as a temporary emergency measure, a wartime inconvenience that would disappear the moment peace returned. It did not disappear. It never does. And the story of how a temporary wartime rule quietly became a permanent fixture of human life is one of the most revealing case studies in how power actually works. Let's start with what a passport even was back then, because it was almost nothing like the document in your drawer today. For most of American history, a passport was essentially a fancy letter of introduction, a single large sheet of paper, slightly bigger than an 11 by 17-inch certificate, politely requesting that foreign officials let the bearer pass and offer assistance if needed. It descended from the old European tradition of letters of safe conduct, documents kings had been issuing to diplomats and favored travelers for centuries. It was a courtesy, a status symbol, something a wealthy gentleman might obtain before his grand tour of Europe, roughly the way you might buy travel insurance today. Useful, reassuring, and completely optional. And in early America, the issuing of these documents was gloriously chaotic. For decades, passports were issued not just by the Department of State, but by individual states, by cities, even by notaries public. Your local official could basically write you a passport. The results were predictable. Documents issued by random American authorities caused confusion abroad, and some European countries refused to recognize them unless a U.S. consular official personally endorsed them. So in 1856, Congress finally stepped in and gave the Department of State the sole authority to issue passports. But notice what Congress did not do. It did not make passports mandatory. It just standardized who could print the courtesy letter. For most of the early republic, a passport remained a helpful accessory rather than a requirement. The numbers tell you everything about how optional they were. Between 1810 and 1873, a period of 63 years, the State Department issued a grand total of about 130,000 passports. That's roughly 2,000 per year for the entire country, during an era when hundreds of thousands of Americans were crossing oceans for business, family visits, and pleasure. the overwhelming majority of travelers simply didn't bother. And here's where the story gets bigger than America, because the United States wasn't an outlier. It was part of a global trend, and the trend was moving toward more freedom of movement, not less. In the mid-19th century, something happened that broke every passport system in Europe: the railroad. The earliest trains of the 1830s traveled at around 30 miles per hour. By 1850, speeds had more than doubled. Suddenly, a traveler could start the day in Paris, have lunch in Brussels, and fall asleep in Amsterdam. Millions of people were now crossing borders at speeds and volumes that no border official could possibly process. The administrative machinery simply could not keep pace. So, in 1861, France made a decisive move. It abolished passport and visa requirements at its frontiers entirely. The logic was simple. Enforcement had become impossible, and free movement was good for the booming tourist economy. Other nations followed, one after another. What emerged was something modern people find almost impossible to believe. Between 1861 and 1914, most people in Europe could cross international borders without showing a passport at all. A German could board a train to Paris, a Swede could sail to London, a Viennese merchant could travel to Amsterdam with nothing more than a ticket in his pocket. And this was not a loophole or lax enforcement. It was the deliberate, broadly shared policy of the continent's most powerful states. Prominent voices in business and government went even further. They viewed the passport as a hindrance to commerce and actively lobbied for abolishing passports everywhere. The educated consensus of the age was that the passport was a relic, a medieval leftover that the modern, connected, globalized world of steamships and telegraphs had simply outgrown. Now, before we romanticize this too much, let's be honest about the asterisks, because they matter. The open door was never open equally. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 effectively banned Chinese immigrants entirely, making them the first group required to carry identity documents to enter the country. A dark preview of the documentary regime that would eventually apply to everyone. The government also made clear it would turn away anarchists, polygamists, criminals, the sick, and anyone deemed unable to support themselves. And class bought you convenience even then. First and second class steamship passengers were not required to undergo inspection at Ellis Island at all. They were quickly interviewed on board and sent on their way, while steerage passengers were ferried to the island for the full examination. Freedom of movement existed, but it was distributed the way most things in the 19th century were distributed, unevenly. There was also one brief moment when America flinched. During the Civil War, from August 1861 to March 1862, passports were suddenly required. Secretary of State William Seward, paranoid about Confederate agents slipping across borders, imposed controls on everyone entering or leaving the country. But here's the fascinating detail. The Attorney General later determined that the executive branch didn't actually have the legal authority to impose such regulations. The requirement quietly died, and the open era resumed as if nothing had happened. For the next 50 years, that's how Americans understood passport requirements, a strange, panicky wartime aberration, something that happened once, briefly, and never again. Then came the summer of 1914, and the world that had spent 50 years dismantling its borders rebuilt them in a matter of weeks. When the First World War erupted, every European government was gripped by the same fear: spies. Enemy agents moving freely across frontiers, carrying information, sabotage plans, propaganda. In an attempt to curtail the operation of enemy spies, European nations made passports and identity documents compulsory almost overnight. The passport-free continent vanished. Britain, which had not required passports for travel to or from the country until the First World War, slammed its ports shut. France did the same. The golden age of free movement ended not by referendum or debate, but by emergency decree. America held out longer. Even after entering the war in April 1917, the United States still had no legal passport requirement for its own citizens. President Wilson had issued an executive order back in December 1915, stating that all persons leaving the U.S. should have passports, but it was a recommendation, not a requirement. The government was essentially asking nicely. That changed on May 22, 1918. Congress passed the Travel Control Act, also known as the Wartime Measure Act, and it permitted the president, when the United States was at war, to proclaim a passport requirement. Wilson issued exactly such a proclamation on August 18, 1918. And this time, the government wasn't asking. The penalties were staggering. Violators faced a fine of up to $10,000, several years' wages for an ordinary worker, or up to 20 years in prison, or both. And Wilson's proclamation went further than just demanding a document. It required travelers to show adequate reasons for their trip and to prove that their travel would not harm American interests. Read that again. For the first time in the country's history, an American citizen needed the government's permission, not just its paperwork, its permission to leave their own country. The burden of proof had flipped. Movement was no longer a default liberty. It was a privilege to be applied for, justified, and granted. If you're finding this as fascinating as I did when I first dug into it, take 1 second to hit subscribe. We uncover forgotten chapters like this every week, straight from the archives. Now, here's where the story was supposed to end. The war ended on November 11, 1918. And the passport requirement lingered all the way until March 3, 1921, the last day of the Wilson administration. Wilson himself fought to extend it, telling Congress in 1919 that lifting travel restrictions would allow in immigrants who were undesirable from the point of view of becoming future citizens. The emergency measure had found a second job, not catching spies, but filtering people. And even when Congress finally removed the wartime restrictions for citizens in March 1921, it retained them for non-citizens. Something deeper had shifted, and it couldn't be shifted back. Americans hated the new documentary reality, by the way. Newspapers in the 1920s openly labeled passport requirements a nuisance. And as historian Craig Robertson has shown, many Americans saw the demand for documentary proof of identity as an insult, a sign that officials considered them dishonest, since identification papers had always been associated with criminals and suspects. Think about that. Within living memory, the idea of having to prove who you were felt degrading to ordinary people. Today we hand over our documents without a second thought. But the machinery kept growing anyway. Even though passports were no longer legally required after 1921, the issuing infrastructure had expanded enormously, and other countries now expected travelers to carry them. Because that's the trap. Once every other nation requires a passport to enter, your own government's requirement barely matters. The gates had gone up everywhere at once. In 1920, the brand new League of Nations held a conference on the passport problem, and the talks actually began with debates about abolishing passports entirely. That's how recent and reversible the whole system still felt. Instead, the League ended up standardizing the passport, the little booklet format, the photo, the uniform layout, turning a wartime improvisation into an international norm. In 1926, the United States introduced its first modern booklet form passport, hard-covered, printed on safety paper with water and light-sensitive ink. The emergency document was becoming a permanent institution, complete with anti-counterfeiting technology. And the open door itself? It was being welded shut through other means. The Immigration Act of 1921 established national quotas and, for the first time ever, an annual cap on immigration. The 1924 Act cut those quotas even further and required immigrants to secure a passport and a visa issued by an American consular official before they even sailed. The Ellis Island world, show up, answer some questions, walk into America, was dead within a single decade. The final act came with the next war. On June 21, 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, Congress passed a new act, and passports have been required ever since. This time, when peace arrived, nobody even pretended the requirement would lapse. A 1978 amendment to the Immigration and Nationality Act finally made it unlawful to enter or depart the United States without a passport, even in peacetime, quietly deleting, after 60 years, the last legal fiction that this was all just a wartime measure. So step back and look at the full arc, because it's genuinely strange. For over a century, the most powerful trend in the Western world was toward open borders. Serious, respectable people believed the passport was going extinct, the way toll gates and city walls had gone extinct. Then, 4 years of war built a system of documents, checkpoints, and permissions, and that system outlived the war, outlived the generation that built it, outlived every promise that it was temporary, not because anyone voted to make it permanent, but because emergency powers have a gravity of their own. Each crisis ratchets control upward. Peace never quite ratchets it back down. The passport in your drawer isn't ancient. Your great-great-grandparents lived in a world where it would have seemed absurd. It is, historically speaking, a brand new invention, a souvenir of the First World War that the entire human race is still carrying more than a century after the armistice. And the next time someone tells you a new emergency measure is only temporary, you now know exactly which story to remember. If this changed the way you look at that little blue booklet, subscribe and drop a like. We go deep on the hidden systems that quietly run your life, and the next story is already on its way.